At what stage will we then actually see this shift from a lack of willingness to publicly criticize not just the system or the subordinates, but the Tsar himself, right? At what point are we going to see Putin being actively called out? At what stage of this process of demise to keep this sort of thought train going? When do we start seeing that? When does it go from
I
being in the shadows to being more public?
believe that there are two prerequisites needed. First of all, the situation is going to get worse. In people's lives. Less food, more layoffs, banks, closing doors and people losing money, or the government seizing deposits, personal bank deposits, things like that. So it's gonna get worse. At this point, the pressure upon Russian people is not enough, in my opinion. And the second one is, I call it a black swan event. Something's gonna happen, such as, for example, another mutiny, just like Wagner mutiny.
This is The Global Gambit.
How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to The Global Gambit, a podcast that looks at the intersection of geopolitics, international relations, and economic statecraft. And someone who we have often on the program to discuss a area that we cover a lot, the Russian economy, the internal, domestic, or aspects of, say, Russian foreign policy and how it's affected by the domestic and economic situations, is Konstantin Smelyoff, host of Inside Russia YouTube channel and good friend and colleague of the channel, who's been on many times at this point. We do this on a monthly basis now, and well, we're back for our monthly installment. At the time of recording, we've had this new peace plan out, and we've also had some revelations around Sergei Lavrov's being gone for 24 hours, although some people say it was not a big deal. We'll break that down. And also, obviously, the big developments around Pokrovsk. We're mainly going to focus on the economics and internal relations of the Siloviki and that sort of thing in this episode. But, if you want to find out more, then check out Konstantin's personal channel and also check out mine, where I did a recent coverage of the Russian appearance off the coast of Britain and what that means for Anglo-Russo relations as much as the NATO alliance more broadly. Konstantin, it's always a pleasure to have you on. Firstly, how are you doing, and what have you been focusing on at the moment? What's really stood out for you in the past month?
Howdy, Pyotr. Pleasure talking to you. Pleasure being here. Thank you for inviting. Well, I'm concentrating on monitoring what's going on in Russia, documenting Russia's demise. I do it every single day.
But do you not think that it's slightly overblown? Every time we talk about Russia's imminent demise or the imminent economic collapse, it's not really on the horizon. That's more wishful thinking from those who want to see Putin fail in Ukraine.
I disagree with you. I think that Russia is done, and it shows right now. There are different signs. But we really have to be careful when we say the demise, because many people have different meanings of this word. What is the demise to you? You're talking about Russian demise affecting the situation in Ukraine, the war in Ukraine. It does, but not directly. A lot of people say, well, Russia, when it demises, Putin will be forced to stop the war in Ukraine. No, he will not be forced. It will continue because domestic economic situation has very little to do with the war in Ukraine. So we really have to separate these two things. Although economic troubles, big troubles, they certainly are affecting, but not directly. Just to give you an example, Uralvagonzavod, that's huge, Russia's largest tank manufacturer, is laying off people. 10% will be laid off I believe, by March of the next year. And that includes those people who are directly involved in producing tanks and other armor and equipment and weapons. So you see that there is an effect, but not a direct effect.
Yeah, I obviously play devil's advocate in a lot of these conversations. Sometimes we do genuinely disagree, but when I put those kinds of questions to you, it's more because I think it's food for thought. Ukraine and Russia is as much a war of narratives and information propagandism as it is the kinetic and economic warfare, right? And one of the things that I get frustrated, and I'm increasingly confident enough to say now, is the extreme rhetoric that is on both sides, right? On the pro-Putinist side, you've got people saying Ukraine is full of Nazis and about to have an imminent demise and will be capitulated in and absorbing back into Russia. But on the pro-Ukraine side, you've got people saying that Russia is going to combust and fragment into multiple different states, which, it could potentially happen. But I think the time horizon that people use is completely absurd. And personally, I think it's very unlikely that Russia breaks into sort of different oblasts, simply because half the oblasts, as we've discussed in previous conversations, are not governable. They don't have enough population, they don't have enough administrative centers. The Far East, or maybe parts of the North Caucasus, could possibly break away. But anyway, the point I'm making with all of this is that I don't get too carried away with using words like imminent and collapse. Not that you do, but some people do. And I just think it's intellectually dishonest to do that. So, when you're talking about the imminent demise, I'm glad that you clarify the word or how you define it. But what parameters, if I put this into a question towards you, what parameters do you look at of the Russian economy that indicates to you that it is perpetually declining still?
Well, first of all, Pyotr, I really love when you play devil's advocate and challenge me. I love being challenged. That's great. I base my reports. You see, I monitor what happens in Russia. And I monitor the official media space, the information and data that comes from the government, from independent small media channels, from the opposition that is based abroad, from the boots on the ground, from people I know who are in Russia. I'm in constant communication with quite a few of them. And I always give facts about Russia. But based on the facts, I forecast things. Okay, I define, I see the trends and I talk about those trends. And when I say Russia is demising, it's actually very simple. When Russia attacked Ukraine, I think it shot itself not even in the foot, but in the stomach. And it's been bleeding out since. Because you got to understand, it's very simple about Russian economy. Russia does not produce much value in terms of manufactured goods, services, and so forth. Yet Russian economy is incredibly strong because it's the largest exporter of fossil fuels and mineral resources, natural resources, really. And that's been Russia's strength for decades since the USSR, okay? Russia had incredible reserves, cash reserves. It still has gold reserves, some foreign currency reserves. And it was raking in a lot of money by selling oil, natural gas, metals, ferrous, non-ferrous metals, and so forth. That stopped. Not completely, but exports have been in decline, and Russia has been earning less and less. And on the other hand, it's been spending more and more. And this is what the demise is. Once you go to a bank and you don't have any money and you have to bills to pay, and the banker goes, your account is zero. It's actually negative, but you got to pay. And this is the demise. And we're seeing the signs of that in Russia. For 3.5 years, it was using the reserves, all kinds of reserves, cash reserves. It was still exporting oil, natural gas, but then less and less so. And now we are at the point where we see that the money is gone. The bank account, savings account that Russia had is empty. The budget deficit is record high. That's the fact. It's not tomorrow. It's not around the corner. It's now. And they are having problems paying off teachers and doctors and medical staff and other government employees. Of course, there are essential government employees such as the KGB personnel, the military, the federal police, the Rosguardia, the riot police. You can't stop paying those folks because you base your regime on them. But teachers and kindergarten teachers and doctors, you definitely can either lay those off or you can just simply delay their salaries. And that's the very first thing that happens. We are seeing it in Russia now. Rostov province is closing schools because there's no money to pay the teachers. That's the fact. You can fact check me. Belgorod province is closing down schools and kindergartens because there's no money to pay. There are problems with electricity in Russia. A couple of weeks ago, there were 26 cities with rolling blackouts, electrical blackouts. That's the fact. But there is a problem with public transportation because it's always been subsidized by the state. And right now, there's no money for the subsidies. So therefore, bus routes are canceled. Look at two cities, Lvov and Rostov-on-Don. And there are other cities as well. It's just I know of these two cities with problems in public transportation sector. So when these things start happening, when the state doesn't function any longer as it's supposed to function, that's what I call the demise. Okay, and this is the start of the acute phase. We're seeing the start. It's like the avalanche. When it just starts happening, it starts moving. We'll be seeing more and more of that, because I don't know if you follow Russian federal budget situation, but there's a
I've
huge
got some questions
deficit
on that to come to. But I did want to ask you, so this is effectively a breakdown in public services, is what you're saying, be it infrastructure, electricity provision, education provision, healthcare, a breakdown of the basic utilities that a government is supposed to prescribe or provide, for its population. Now, one of the other areas
that's the start. Let me say it's the start. Yes, it starts with the state stopping functioning properly, but then the state starts applying violence, using violence against people who start showing dissent, disagreement with the state, saying, hey, what's going on? Then we will see the next step is the violence. We're also seeing the first signs, and then there will be chaos descending upon Russia.
But what about, therefore, the pensions aspect? One of the questions that people have often emphasized that, one of Putin's biggest supporter bases, voter bases, is older rural communities. And that's because he oversees and has a strong control or influence over the prescription of pensions. And if you start seeing a cutback of pensions to this, that will affect Putin's popularity and ultimately his broader stability. Do you agree with that? Is there more to it? Obviously, there's more to it, but how much of that is a component as well?
It's really hard to say of what Putin's popularity right now. We can only rely on very unofficial data. Well, from what I'm seeing is that a lot of people in Russia are angry. Very angry. Literally, they start seeing that things are not well. They build informational bubbles around them when the war started, because it's really hard to admit that your country is at the war and you're paying for the war with your taxes. And you're a citizen of a country who's attacked and waging a war on your neighbor. It's so what you do, you build an informational bubble saying, you know what, don't talk about that stuff with me. I mind my own business. I don't think of the war. It's far away, But then you can last in your bubble for so long, and then sooner or later it gets poked by the government and it bursts. And that's exactly what's happening right now, because when you go to a store and the TV sells you the story, everything's going according to the plan and fine, and Russia is doing mighty fine economically, and you go to a store and you see that you can't afford food. By the way, in Russia, in September and October, Russians bought 6% less food in units, liters, kilos. Okay, they paid more rubles, but they bought less stuff.
Right.
Russians are eating less now. That is one of the big signs of the demise. Okay, and this is just the beginning. So when that happens, they understand that something is very wrong, that something is going not right in their country, and then they start blaming someone. At this point, not many of them blame Putin. They blame those who surround Putin, the ministers. They lie to him. Putin doesn't know things. Had he known, he would have taken care. He would fix things. It's the enemies. It's the Americans. It's the
If
British.
I understand you correctly, Konstantin, are you saying that this is the attempt by the average Russian to justify or explain it to themselves?
Absolutely. So I don't know how, what's going on with the support of Putin himself. Okay, but Russians are very, very angry at the situation in the country.
Why is there such a lack of response from the people? Why and when will the average Russian start holding Putin more to account instead of blaming the system or the people around him, when it's him that has put half those people in those places in the early days of his presidency?
What kind of response from Russian people do you expect?
More vocalism, more criticism? Doesn't mean out there with pitchforks and torches, but I don't see much criticism apart from on Telegram by anonymous accounts.
Where would you be looking at such criticism at?
Well, we've outlaid them. The lack of public services, the breakdown of education, the...
No. Where would you see that people would be criticizing? On Russian TV and the newspapers, in the social
Well, you do
media?
occasionally see it on Russian TV. Even some of the big vocal proponents of this SMO have been critical of Putin's decision-making at times.
Never Putin, never. Ministers, the government, the prime minister, the foreigners, the foreign agents, the Russians who fled Russia, just like myself, we are to blame. They are to blame, never Putin. I haven't heard. If someone blames Putin, he or she is dealt with very, very swiftly. Okay, so Russian media space is controlled 100%. And it's monitored. And in case something is said by anyone who what's not allowed, then people get silenced very quickly. And then Russians know that. Russians know what if they show open criticism, they'll be dealt with. So that therefore they are keeping their mouths shut, and they are vocal at their kitchens, which neither you or me hear, just like in the USSR. That's where they feel safe, in the kitchens, with their cell phones stocked away somewhere. So they're afraid that they are listened through cell phones. So that's why we're not seeing any anger, any dissent, because there are simply no platforms in Russia to see that anger. But people are angry. I feel it. I talk to them. I listen to them. I watch the independent anonymous Telegram channels and other media outlets. So do not expect them to stand up and go protesting on the streets. That'd be the last day of their freedom.
So to continue this point, at what stage will we then actually see this shift from a lack of willingness to publicly criticize not just the system or the subordinates, but the Tsar himself, right? At what point are we going to see Putin being actively called out? At what stage of this process of demise to keep this sort of thought train going? When do we start seeing that? When does it go from being in the shadows to being more public?
Believe that there are two prerequisites needed. First of all, the situation is going to get worse in people's lives. Less food, more layoffs, banks, closing doors and people losing money, or the government seizing deposits, personal bank deposits, things like that. So it's going to get worse. At this point, the pressure upon Russian people is not enough, in my opinion. And the second one is, I call it a black swan event. Something's going to happen, such as, for example, another mutiny, just like Wagner mutiny, or something outrageous happening in the Kremlin, or someone's death. Something that will happen most likely unexpectedly. And after that, the situation will just unfold uncontrollably. I always draw parallels with the USSR. Look what happened. If someone told us in August 1st that 4 weeks later we'd be living in a different country, August 1st of 1991, then we would laugh. And then the USSR, that was a black swan event, GKChP, and the USSR fell apart in 3 days. Okay? I expect Russia following the footsteps of the USSR. That's where I think the country is heading to very fast.
But when you say that, in what capacity? Because Russia is not made up of a conglomerate, a confederation of other states. It's a singular nation state. So when you say a similar pathway, what, you're going to see the fragmentation of Russia? Or are we going to see the North
No, not necessarily. I understand the question. Not necessarily. I don't mean Russia breaking into smaller parts. I mean the change of the regime. First of all, what happened in the USSR, the regime changed. Fell apart, basically.
Yeah.
The communism fell, and that's the Putin's regime. The Putinism fall. That's what
the
I
end of
may
the
mean.
Putinistic
But yes, but what you're saying is possible. I believe that it is possible for Russia to break into smaller parts, and we start seeing the signs, not the signs, but small fires of that, because they need, a big fire is needed for that. That would be a really history-changing event for the country, okay? And that the situation would need to be dire. But there are some, for example, Alexander Ivanov, official from one of the official parties, a member of Yakutia Assembly, Yakutia Parliament, openly speaks against Moscow and calls for other republics and provinces of Russia to get together and move against Moscow. Well, move to Moscow and start asking questions. What the hell Moscow is doing? It's happening right now. And he's been followed by the secret police, obviously. He's considered a threat to the country, but they haven't got to him because they don't have any legal foundation for arresting him. Okay, he's still the deputy of the local parliament, but it's happening. There is a small fire in Altai. There have been arrests. There is fire in Ufa. Obviously, Chechnya is, a powder keg, gunpowder keg. Okay, so I wouldn't rule out the situation when Russia would start shaking and breaking apart. How probable is that? That is, I don't know, but that's a possibility.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, Konstantin, I think that, one, I don't really want to see the breakup of Russia unless it's a voluntarily and authentically held referendum on, the self-determination of smaller territories, right? But realistically, I think it would either be the North Caucasus because of the more Muslim majorities of, Dagestan and Chechnya, for example, and also the Far East. I am increasingly worried, although it's obviously not going to happen tomorrow, about Chinese interests over Manchuria and the historical conflict between the Chinese and the Soviet Union in the 60-70 border clash. I do genuinely think that's a possibility.
You're right on.
It's speculation. Anyway, we could talk about that in the future maybe, or we could discuss it later. But anyway, just on the economic theme for now, I wanted to ask you, because in the previous conversation we had, I think it was last month, I asked you about the importance of frozen assets, and your response was pretty blunt and doesn't matter. Has your opinion changed about that because of new information that's come out, new decisions by the European Union or whatever, or you think no difference? It's not going to make a big difference, the prospect of frozen assets for Ukraine's reconstruction?
Well, the big question right now, will the frozen assets of Russia be seized in the future? And I think there have been steps taken in the past month. I believe the only country that is against is Belgium, because the assets are in Belgium. And the Belgium is scared that if the war stops, when the war stops, then Russia might sue the country to demand the assets back, seized illegally, okay? But there are tools how to avoid such situation. For example, insuring, and I know that people in Europe are working on coming up with a plan to ensure this situation so Belgium would feel safe. I mean, my position is still the same. It's just I see that steps, tiny baby steps, but they are being made.
Okay, interesting. I don't know. I'm not entirely sure what to make of that. I've never followed it too intricately because I don't know how viable it is. And obviously the US does have a large say on that, on one aspect of that. But anyway, the Kremlin is definitely having a tough time, even if they are winning in Pokrovsk or having the momentum over Pokrovsk. Things are not great internally. I think that was the bottom line that, we can all agree on, that it's not exactly prime time.
I think that Lavrov's fate is up in the air because he can be made the scapegoat, and he's a very good figure for that. Or perhaps Putin decides to move forward as usual, then Lavrov will be back and as if nothing happened, as if he hadn't been missing for a month now, okay? And the propaganda will be silent, and Russian people, they have very short memory. And forget about that, and just